How does a failed art student become responsible for the deaths of millions? How does one person convince an entire nation to follow him into darkness? How does a human mind become capable of orchestrating systematic genocide? Psychology has spent 80 years trying to answer these questions, analyzing interviews, studying behavior patterns, examining childhood trauma, reviewing psychiatric reports. And what they found is terrifying, not because he was a monster born evil, but because he was human, with psychological patterns we can identify and understand. In the next 5 minutes, we're going to examine the psychological profile that researchers have constructed, not to excuse, but to understand. Because understanding how minds break is how we prevent it from happening again. Every psychological profile starts with childhood, because that's where the patterns begin. Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in Austria, and his childhood was marked by 3 defining psychological elements. 1. Severe paternal abuse. His father, Alois Hitler, was brutally violent. Regular beatings, constant humiliation, unpredictable rage. Psychology tells us that children who experience severe abuse develop one of 2 responses. They internalize it and become victims forever, or they externalize it and become perpetrators later. Hitler chose the second path. The boy who was beaten and humiliated spent his adult life ensuring he would never be powerless again, and that others would experience the helplessness he once felt. 2. Maternal enmeshment. His mother, Clara, was the opposite, doting, protective, treating him as special and gifted despite evidence to the contrary. This created what psychologists call narcissistic injury. He internalized the message that he was exceptional, destined for greatness. But the world kept telling him he wasn't. When reality doesn't match the inflated self-image, narcissistic rage follows. 3. Early rejection and failure. He dreamed of being an artist. He applied to art school twice, rejected both times. For someone whose entire identity was built on being special, this rejection was devastating. Psychologically, he couldn't accept that he simply wasn't talented enough. So he needed someone to blame, someone who stole his deserved success. This is where the conspiracy thinking began. The paranoid belief that external forces, specifically Jewish people, were responsible for his failures. This patterned childhood abuse, inflated self-image, repeated rejection, created a psychological powder keg. Psychologists who studied Hitler identified several key personality traits. Malignant narcissism. This is narcissism combined with antisocial traits, paranoia, and sadism. He believed he was historically destined for greatness. Any criticism was proof of conspiracy against him. Any failure was someone else's fault. Any opposition justified total destruction. He lacked empathy entirely. People weren't humans, they were tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. Paranoid thinking. He saw enemies everywhere, conspiracies, threats, betrayals. This wasn't psychosis. He wasn't hallucinating. But his thinking was fundamentally paranoid. He interpreted neutral events as attacks. He saw patterns that didn't exist. He believed in elaborate conspiracies. This paranoid worldview made him dangerous because he genuinely believed he was fighting for survival against an existential threat. To him, genocide wasn't murder, it was self-defense. Charismatic manipulation. Here's what people misunderstand. He wasn't a raving lunatic. In person, he could be charming, persuasive. He knew how to read people, mirror emotions, and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. Psychopaths often have this ability superficial charm, masking complete absence of genuine human connection. He understood mass psychology. He knew how to exploit fear, resentment, and national humiliation. He gave people a scapegoat for their pain and positioned himself as their savior. Inability to process shame. Every time he experienced shame or humiliation rejection from art school, Germany's defeat in WWII, personal failures, he couldn't integrate it. Instead, he transformed shame into rage, into blame, into a mission to punish those he believed had humiliated him and his nation. This is classic narcissistic defense. When the false self is threatened, destroy the threat rather than face the painful reality. Looking back, there were clear psychological warning signs. Patterns that, had people understood them, might have stopped what came next. 1. Dehumanizing language. He didn't talk about Jewish people as humans. They were vermin, parasites, disease. Psychology knows. When you linguistically remove humanity from a group, violence against them becomes psychologically easier. Dehumanization is always the first step toward atrocity. 2. Grandiose delusions of destiny. He genuinely believed he was chosen by fate to save Germany and purify the race. This wasn't political strategy, this was pathological grandiosity. He saw himself as a messianic figure. When someone believes they're historically destined for greatness and that normal rules don't apply to them, that's a massive red flag. 3. Inability to accept responsibility. Nothing was ever his fault. Every failure was betrayal. Every loss was sabotage. This external locus of control, combined with paranoid thinking, created a worldview where genocide became necessary because he was constantly under attack. 4. Progressive isolation from reality. As he gained power, he surrounded himself only with yes-men. Anyone who disagreed was removed. This created an echo chamber where his most delusional ideas were never challenged. Reality testing disappeared. His grasp on truth eroded. By the end, he was making military decisions based on fantasy, giving orders to armies that no longer existed. This is what happens when narcissistic personality disorder meets absolute power. The person loses all connection to reality. Here's why studying this psychological profile matters. These patterns still exist. The psychology that enabled this narcissistic leadership, dehumanizing rhetoric, paranoid conspiracy thinking, exploitation of national grievance, scapegoating of vulnerable groups, none of that disappeared in 1945. Psychology teaches us that understanding the warning signs is our best defense against repetition. When we see leaders who use dehumanizing language about groups of people, can never admit mistakes or accept responsibility, present themselves as uniquely destined for greatness, exploit fear and resentment for power, surround themselves with yes-men and reject criticism, promote conspiracy theories to explain away failures. We need to recognize these as psychological danger signs. Not every narcissist becomes genocidal, but genocidal leaders consistently show these narcissistic patterns. The point isn't to diagnose every politician we dislike. The point is to understand that atrocity doesn't require cartoon villains. It requires normal psychological patterns: narcissism, paranoia, tribalism, fear escalated to their extreme and given power. Understanding the psychology isn't about making excuses. It's about prevention. Because the scariest truth psychology teaches us is this: evil rarely looks like a monster. It usually looks like a wounded person who was given power and convinced themselves their pain justified anything. The psychological profile of Adolf Hitler shows us something uncomfortable. He wasn't born a monster. He became one through a combination of childhood trauma, personality pathology, and a system that gave unlimited power to an unstable mind. The lesson isn't understand to forgive. The lesson is understand to prevent, because the psychology that enabled history's darkest chapter didn't die with him. Those patterns, narcissism, paranoia, dehumanization, scapegoating, they're still here, still present in humans, still dangerous when combined with power. The best defense against repeating history is understanding the psychology behind it, so we can see the warning signs. Call them out. Stop them before they escalate. That's why we study darkness, not to excuse it, but to ensure it never happens again.